the topic of this roundtable. So this is a roundtable. There are no slides. We are going to discuss an important topic for competition law investigation, market definition, and market power evaluation in dynamic industry. So for this panel, we have three distinguished speakers that I'm going to introduce very briefly. To my far right is Tzanaki, who is an associate professor in the law department at Lund University, although I'm told that may change. And then next to me is Andrea Pezzoli, who is Vice Segretario Generale the Italian Competition Authority, and previously was the chief economist. And then to my left is Thibaud Vergé, who was recently appointed vice president of the French Competition Authority, but before that, Thibaud has a long-standing career in academic research. He also was affiliated with CRA. So before I turn to the panelists, just very briefly, market definition, market power. Market definition, for those who are familiar with the work of a competition authority, is essentially a necessary step in most investigation, except in hardcore cartel. So an authority would have to define the so-called relevant market. This exercise is largely static. If you consider the hypothetical monopolies framework, and the way usually it's thought through and the evidence that has been gathered is usually focusing on demand side substitution, and there's usually little thought being given to dynamism. Market power, on the other hand, itself is also typically a static measure. I mean, in the econ literature, it's usually the learner index. It's not often, even hardly ever used in competition law investigation. Instead, authority tend to rely, based on their market definition, on market share to approximate some notion of market power. And these market share typically play an extremely important role in many settings, in particular in merger control. They are a first filter. In abuse of dominant position, they play also a critical role to determine whether a company is deemed to be dominant. So that was the easy part for me, just to set the scene, to tell you the two important concepts that my fellow panelists will have to discuss, which is how do you deal with market definition and market power in dynamic industries. So I'm going to start with Andrea, and I'm going to ask them, each of them, obviously, to give us their thoughts and their view on these two topics, and also consider what do we call dynamic industry. So Andrea will start from his enforcer perspective.
Thank you, Benoît. Thank you for inviting me in this conference. And okay, I start. I'm just saying that in preparing the organization of this panel, Benoît kindly and strongly asked us to provide a tentative definition of dynamic industries in order to set the table and afterwards to deal with the very topic of the theme. I'll try. It's not an easy task. Right? Just from an empirical point of view, from a practical point of view, I would say. And I think that, I mean, when we speak of dynamic industry, I think that we have to speak about existing markets where competition is mainly based on innovation, and there is a residual role for price competition, quotation mark, because I'm not sure. And this means that we are not dealing only with digital markets, but also with pharmaceutical, for instance. There is a second category that I have in mind, not existing markets, where competition may take place at the research and development level. I'm thinking of Bayer Monsanto or something like that. New markets whose development mainly depends on data, where it is not that easy to identify the boundaries of the so-called relevant markets. I mean, this morning, a lot of speakers talked about the complements which become substitutes at the same time. So, I mean, with such a trick, I mean, designing the boundaries of a market is not that easy. By and large, I think that when we speak of dynamic industries, we speak of industries where intervention has to be extremely careful. We have to handle with care. I mean, speaking as an enforcer, we don't want to discourage the new Google, but I mean, but when we realize that the new Google is not emerging and is out of view, I mean, we start thinking that it might be too late to intervene with ex post tools, and we start privileging ex-ante intervention, hopefully future-proof ex-ante intervention, and we start looking at market power in a different perspective. And bigness as such begins again to matter. I don't know if it is a great perspective, but I mean, we do not forget that dynamic competition may take place also in traditional markets. I mean, it's enough to think of disruptive innovation, which affected a very, very traditional, very mature market. And finally, as Thibaud reminded us this morning, there are also other situations where dynamic competition takes place, like the failing firm defense, or where entry or the boundaries of the geographical market are not that sound. I'm thinking of Siemens Alstom, where the threat of the Chinese competition was, I mean, not today, not the day after today, but I mean, in order to enlarge the boundaries of the market, of the relevant market. Of course, I mean, dynamic industries raise significant challenges for market definition, which in my modest view may still play an important role. And above all, for the assessment of market power. I think that the main challenge comes from the need to predict the scope and the benefits of future competition. I mean, I was impressed, I was really interested by what Gordon said this morning about the scope and scale economies, and he suggested that in defining relevant market, we have to look more deeply on what happens on the supply side. I think that in this perspective, the difficult task for antitrust agencies is the assessment of potential competition. That is the key. Identifying potential competitors is key, which means that we need a dynamic assessment and a different and longer, wider time horizon. Again, this morning, Thibaud explained quite clearly how hard it could be to forecast future entry. And I think that, again, that the challenge concerns not only the technological challenge, but also the geographical challenge. As I mentioned before, I mean, Chinese competition and the geographical boundaries could be interesting to take into consideration. Having said that, I think that this is an effort which may be quite challenging for legal certainty. And therefore, I think that it may be understandable, the request which comes from the companies, from the lawyers for safe harbors. On the other hand, it may be equally understandable the need for a reversal burden of proof. When the parties, especially when the parties assume or argue for future efficiency. But I think that even if it is a difficult task, I think that the right answer cannot be achieved just by freezing actual competitive market conditions and assuming away all unpredictable benefits of future competition, especially those which may derive from today's less efficient competitors. I mean, Bowman this morning used a free, let's say, quotation from John Maynard Keynes. I mean, the most popular one in the long run, all companies will be dead. I always like to add a less popular quotation from John Maynard Keynes, which is, in the long run, almost everything can be possible. I mean, we have to see both sides. There is not only one case. But I mean, let's now move to more practical consideration from my experience as an enforcer. I think that in recent years, the Italian Competition Authority had to cope with market definition and market power in dynamic industries in several cases. I mean, starting from a case concerning merger review, it was a joint venture between NLX, a state-owned company, an Italian state-owned company in the energy sector, and Volkswagen, concerning the development of electric mobility charging infrastructures. And we had to assess the impact on new and developing markets. In that case, in this case, potential competition was key. The identification and the role which could be played by potential entrants was not that simple. We had to interview a lot of them, or potential new entrants. What was quite clear in that case is that market shares, and I mean current market shares, were more or less meaningless. I mean, moving to two interesting cases concerning violation of Article 102, and in both cases, it has been relatively easier to assess the market power of the dominant player. Our efforts, I mean, the efforts of the Italian Competition Authority, more or less successful, were focused on the definition of the dynamic, innovative markets which could be affected by the abusive conducts. In the case, again, Google NLX, again, concerning the services related to electromobility, the theory of harm was a refusal to access, currently is under the lens of the Court of Justice. So we'll see if our approach was sound enough. But anyway, from just focusing on the market definition and market power, the new and developed app, the new app developed by the Italian company could have been a significant competitive constraint for the collection of data currently provided by Google Maps. In fact, the app provided by NLX could be a higher quality service for electric cars drivers, since it allows not only to map the charging stations and to know if they are vacant, but also it allows the possibility to reserve the station. Google's market power, I mean, so the Google's dominant position has been assessed in a quotation mark in a traditional way. I mean, looking at the multi-sided markets, I mean, the side-by-side approach privileged by in Europe. And the crucial ingredient was the quasi-essential facility role played by Android Auto, an app which can be used directly on the screen of the car and which allows the interoperability between the infotainment of the car and the apps which are consistent with the Android Auto. That was the challenge. There is another case concerning an abuse of dominant position, but which is still in progress. I can speak of the problem concerning market definition. And we are actually dealing with the effects of Google conduct on the development of a new market, where the intermediaries that can be authorized by users to collect their individual data from different platforms and resell them to advertisers, shifting part of the profits to the owners of the individual data. I mean, Posner's sons would describe the intermediaries as a sort of digital trade unions for platforms users. I mean, some of you had read Radical Markets can get this one, the quotation. The new market, I mean, or the new intermediaries could represent, at least in the medium run, a competitive constraint for Google. So the new intermediaries as potential competitors. Finally, in a third occasion, we had to cope with market definition and market power, which in this framework, it is, I mean, not so innovative, but I mean, I'm speaking of the violation of Article 102 by Amazon in the case Amazon FBA. And in that case, there was a mixture of dynamic and traditional markets. I mean, dynamic, the online distribution, online marketplace, and the traditional market was the market concerning the logistics services. On the one hand, we dealt with Amazon's dominant position and the dilemma, but I don't think it is a real dilemma, was the assessment of market power in two-sided markets. So the American and the European approach, which at the end of the day, quite often converge to the same outcome. On the other hand, the assessment of potential competition. And the question was, to which extent can Amazon's current logistics suppliers be considered Amazon's as efficient competitors in the future? So the key role played by the scale economists and the static bias of the as efficient competitor test emerged in that case. Let me conclude, I hope to be in time, with a more general statement. I mean, I think that in my view, the challenges faced by market definition and the assessment of market power in dynamic industries are strictly linked with the concept of competition that restores the intrinsic interplay between liberty and efficiency, a concept of competition that acknowledges economic freedom as a key source of social efficiency and that considers the protection of the competitive process its natural goal. Therefore, antitrust shouldn't be focused only on static efficiency and shouldn't be confined to the protection of the outcome of past competition. In other words, and more frankly, more directly, today's efficiency is not necessarily the best predictor of tomorrow's efficiency. I mean, it might be a paradox, but in this perspective, the so-called neo-Brandasian challenge to look at competition as an ongoing process might hide more than one similarity with the Austrian school and with IXQ. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Andrea. So I'm going to turn now to Thibaud to give his first remark on the topic.
Thank you, Benoît. So I'll try to stick to the time and maybe only make two series of points. So first, going back to type of situations where we see dynamic issues, I think there are at least, I can see at least three types. So the one we are talking most about today are so digital markets, platforms where I don't think there's much more to say. So I'll come back to difficulties that it raises for market definition and market power in a minute. But let me just mention two others. So Andrea mentioned markets driven by R&D and innovation. So we know a lot of the pharma cases of the past or recent pharma cases. And these are already markets where we've known for years that current market shares are not always good indicators of what is going on. And we need to look at life of patents. So patents are going to expire for originators at some point. New entrants will come in. There's the need to look at the pipelines of drugs that can be developed or even in merger cases, whether the pipelines of the different parties are overlapping or not. So these are not really new issues for antitrust agencies. So we've been looking at that for decades now. Or the recent cases on the innovation theory of arms, there's nothing really new there. And I think we are not even talking. So Pierre mentioned a few of the possibilities. So entry, exit this morning. But just think of mergers of standard consumer goods. We do a lot of merger simulations to look at price effects, but there are lots of other dynamic effects at play that could be at play. So merging firms might want to reposition products, relabel products. We can look at entry of competitors following the merger. So for those who have read Luis Cabral's paper on Staples Office Depot, we know that badly designed remedies might prevent entry in the future of competitors. So these are dynamic effects that have always been at play and that are not really new or specific to digital markets. So moving on to market definition and market shares, I think so. We know there are extremely difficult topics in dynamic industries, but I don't think they are going to go away very soon. We are still going to define markets and compute market shares, but so one should remember that that's not the end of the case. So hopefully we don't stop there and we go a bit further. So we still need to develop coherent theory of arms that are going far beyond the market shares, as we've done in merger cases in non-dynamic industries. So it doesn't stop at market shares and even in static cases. So market definition is more there to set the scene and see and try to look at, so limit the scope of what we are looking at. And it's extremely difficult to start talking about market definition, including products that we don't even know, or firms that maybe don't yet exist and could be there. So for sure, we are not going to change much the way we define markets in dynamic industries. It's more in the building the theory of arm that we are going to discuss that later. So it's clear that in digital markets, already that exercise with existing firms and existing products will often be very difficult. So Andrea mentioned the two-sided markets and the way we look at them by looking at two different markets on two different sides. There's already the debate of whether that's the right way to do it, or in other markets, we should only look at one global market for the platforms, or how do you treat ecosystems in this setting? So clearly that's an issue, and it makes it already difficult just looking at current products, but I don't see how we are going to include the new products in this market definition. So that's not where it's going to change. So next step will be market share. So we are still going to compute market shares. That's not going to go away very soon, or at least until judges tell us we can stop computing market shares. And we had the same debate 10 years ago in static industries. If we want to talk about static industries, we know even in these markets, market shares are not necessarily a good indicator of market power. But we've developed many alternative measures that can be used to measure market power. So anything to look at closeness of substitution, all these UPPs, GUPPs, vertical GUPPs, IPR, whatever you want. So put any acronym you want, have been used in the past, and but at least there's a consensus on how to analyze this and what we can do with them. So the question is, what are the alternative measures in dynamic markets? And it's not very clear that there is a strong consensus today that we have alternative measures to use. I know there's been a bit of debate in one of the OECD reports a few years ago on possible alternative measures accounting for intensity of innovation or investment by firms. But so if we want to go further and have this type of alternative measures, we first need to develop them and test them. And I'm not sure they will really fit all the cases. So it really looks like we are more going away by identifying reasonable theory of arms rather than alternative measures on market power. So I think where the story will go in the dynamic industries is more by looking at how we develop sound theory of arms. And Pierre has already discussed that a bit this morning on so whether how sophisticated we want to make them, and what kind of empirical measures or facts we can use to sustain or eliminate such theories. But I think that's more where things are moving than really on market definition and measuring market shares. And just on that side also, that's going a bit away from the topic of the round table. And Andrea mentioned there is this difficult balance to find between protecting innovation and so not killing the new Google too early and at the same time not coming too late in the markets by letting these new potential competitors being eliminated from the market. So that's where things are going to be difficult. There's also the debate on so protecting means we are not going to be too lax anyway. And Pierre mentioned the as efficient competitor test. I think here it's clear if we think competition, so less efficient entrants are always useful. Take any, even in a static model. So there's no need to have a dynamic industries there. But it's even worse in this type of industries. And we had the same debate in you don't even need network effects, but just with economies of scale. The question is, if you want to do your margin squeeze test or as efficient competitor test in markets where new entrants are going to compete for a small share of the market against large incumbents, there's always the question of whether you should do the test by looking at the current average cost of the existing incumbent, or whether you want to look at the cost of a reasonable competitor that would enter at a smaller scale on the market. So these type of issues will always be there, and it looks like if we in these markets where learning by doing will be important, clearly less efficient competitors are still important because they are potentially the tomorrow's competitors. And so where you set the limit on becomes even more difficult than running the AEC tests that we already know are difficult today in static contests. So and I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Thibaud. So we'll turn now to Anna, who is going to take a more academic perspective to this whole debate.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you all. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's also extra nice to be here because I'm among very established scholars that I admire. And I also did my postdoc here, so it's great to come back without restrictions. So I'm not an economist and I'm not an enforcer either. So that's why the introduction that I will give some academic points. So there will be hopefully minimal overlaps in what I'm gonna say. I think I will start by covering some conceptual points of what perhaps how we need to think about these issues, and maybe I raise more questions than I give answers, but it's a roundtable, so I think I'm allowed to do that. And then I will move on and discuss the enforcement side and how we can think of these conceptual issues in an enforcement framework, and perhaps the welfare and legal standards that we need to use in this dynamic setting that we are discussing. So I want to start with market definition and its function from a legal perspective. So why do we use it and when? So I don't know all this esoteric language of economics, as I told you, but so what we know is that we use market definition in non-cartel cases usually to either prove harm or, show damages and different kinds of things. So it's something that it's necessary. And so we don't have a legal shortcut in non-cartel cases, basically. And we take this economic framework and we accept it in this competition law community because we think it's a good way to screen situations where competitive harm and market power could lead to competitive harm. And why we do that? Because we think perhaps that the context is important, okay? And the market definition perhaps can help to distinguish between horizontal or direct and non-direct competition, okay? So that's its basic thinking. And so we try to screen out, so to say, situations that could be socially desirable. types of conduct, so vertical situations, other kinds of situations that we think that perhaps could raise less alarm. Now, when we bring dynamic competition in the picture, things start to get more blurry a little bit. So we heard from the previous speakers that, you know, market boundaries are not so clear cut. What we mean by direct competition is not clear. Is it about substitutes? Is it complements that could become substitutes? Is it about ecosystems? And so on. And that brings me to the second point about the notion of potential competition, okay? So why I link this to this idea of market definition? Because from my perspective, how I see it, I see two different types of potential competition. I see a direct type, okay, where you have more closer substitutes, so to say, and I see an indirect type as well, in which case you can have more dynamic situations where, you know, complementors or ecosystems or different kinds of business models compete. And that is a much more uncertain and more peculiar thing to predict, but also to assess, okay? Because it's something, you know, disruption. You're not supposed to predict it, okay? So it's interesting to think how, you know, when we come up with a doctrine, a notion of potential competition, how we can take both sides into account, okay? And make them work harmonically in a conceptual, but also enforcement framework, okay? And another point, so I think, so the point is that when we assess market definition or market power, especially in dynamic markets, maybe we need to think, and that is very often raised beyond structural analysis and structural indicators, such as market shares and so on. However, at the same time, there are kinds of structural indicators that have relevance when we assess potential competition. For example, what do I mean? So let's say we want to assess a merger, okay, and it's about an acquisition of a potential competitor. And what are we assessing? And we are only assessing whether, you know, there is some substitutability or competitive pressure by this company, or do we also need to think if there are many of those potential competitors? And if there are many, maybe it's not such a big deal. So we see that the numbers and certain structural thinking still applies, but in a very different way than we are used to. Then the point about time horizon was already made. So perhaps we need to tailor or complement our short-term view of both effects and welfare standards in competition cases. So time horizon, both with regards to harm and effect and efficiencies, as it was already mentioned. So we need to take into account both sides of the coin. But also perhaps, as I said, move away from strong structural indicators and or potentially, as Thibaud said, we will not get rid of them, but maybe we want to be sure that what we're looking is really for the effects and not get stuck in a really trap, so to say. And that brings me to my next point, which is, you know, I was reading Professor Tiss's work, and I was very intrigued, who talks about this black box view of the firm. And I found it very interesting because he talks that we need to focus also on the entrepreneurial, managerial, you know, behavior of companies and their capabilities and so on. And peculiarly, I find that this links nicely to my other stream of work, which is about common ownership and how the ownership structures between competing companies can create harmful or beneficial effects. But I was thinking there is this debate between corporate governance people and antitrust people about the beneficial effects in terms of organizational forms, for example, with regards to the market of corporate control on the one hand, okay, so managerial efficiency, organizational efficiency. In the case of dynamic markets, one could think about, business models in dynamic markets as well. So it is a different type of efficiency, essentially, than what we traditionally look at in competition law and policy, which is more static, productive kind of efficiencies. And I think this is something, so this essentially, I think that, technological development, but other kinds of developments in governance structures are pushing us a little bit to move beyond this black box view of the firm, essentially, and look more into the specific of how shareholders, managers, the board behave, and so on. And also the performance of the firm. Linked to that, my next point is, maybe I've already mentioned that, we need to go beyond structural analysis. Structural analysis, not just market shares, but perhaps we need to move and look more at behavior. I gave one example, managerial behavior. But then I was thinking maybe this has deeper implications in the sense that, the whole notion of merger control has strong structural, origins, so to say. So if we look at behavior, actually, we'll go more towards a strategic model of merger control, or something that will have more of this strong structural, framework that we are all familiar with. My next point is about the notion of consumer harm. And especially when we talk about ecosystems or, multi-sided markets, then I'm not sure that the notion of market definition and market power, maybe there is a disconnect between that and consumer harm. And maybe we need to think of a broader notions of harm, balancing different kinds of harm and benefit to different actors, not only consumers, but also this time dimension. So what is the horizon of the harm? And that necessarily, or maybe indirectly, pushes us to think in more of a total welfare terms, okay? Which maybe for pragmatic reasons, we push away from merger control, but maybe it's coming back to us, so to say. And my last point is about the stance of public policy in general. And, all these trade-offs that I mentioned, like short-term, long-term, consumers versus other actors, efficiencies that we traditionally disregard in antitrust, we call them out-of-market efficiencies, as opposed to within markets. These trade-offs, I think, push, if we want to take these considerations into account, they will push policy to be non-neutral. Like economic policy tries to argue that, no, we just, we're neutral in this. We just focus on the consumer harm and we don't want to trade off different types of consumers or different types of actors and so on. But I feel that if we want to take this more holistic approach, then that might be more necessary. And that goes also to the point about remedies. So what do we decide about the enforcement framework and how we, we frame market definition, market power, the harm question that I just mentioned will influence necessarily the question of remedies as well. And for example, in mergers, who do we decide that is the best buyer for a divestiture remedy? Is it more important that it's a non-strategic buyer? And what do we mean by strategic? Is it someone who is like a subsidy or a complement, or, all these things? You see, there is a chain that carries over from one question to another that we cannot avoid, even if we claim to avoid market definition in a way. And I think there are important points. And lastly, about remedies, we see that there will be a tension, I think, between competition, preserving competition, but also allowing for restructuring and change in general in industries. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. So basically you raise a lot of issues. So if we were to take them one by one, I think we will be done by 6. So we might not do that.
That's good.
But we'll come back to some of this. So, I mean, I will open the floor eventually to others, but a couple of reactions to what have been said, also by Andrea and Thibaud, and giving them, asking them some questions. I mean, it seems clear from what we hear is that market definition and market share are going to be there, and they're going to continue to be as they are as today, because they are probably a useful starting point for many agencies. But as we've heard, and market share, which play a very important role, by the way, in competition or investigation. I'm gonna, for any firm and any private practice lawyers, market share are extremely useful, even though we might think they are meaningless from an economic perspective, but extremely useful to advise client about what could happen, and if they were going to do a merger, or whether they may be dominant, for example. That they use this very, very careful. They use this quite heavily. Now, we've heard that, well, actually, market share is not the end of the story, and we all know that. And in practice, how is that going to work? How are you going to give, firm who are involved in dynamic industry or in dynamic markets, the comfort that actually the market share that is being computed now, which maybe says 60%, is actually doesn't really mean that they are dominant because of the threat. We know, and Thibaud said, in differentiated product market, we have some sort of tools to discount those market share. You use diversion ratios to get a sense of closeness of competition, and with the GUPI and all of that, you get something more refined. But when it comes to dynamic industry, which seems to be a world characterized by innovation, everybody seems to be agree. How do you do that? How do you tell people, well, don't worry, market share, we'll discount it, we'll discard it? And I'm not saying it's an easy question, but I'm going to ask Andrea first.
I mean, it's a good question, because I mean, as I tried to say before, market share and market definition are seriously under pressure, but I think that we still need them somehow. But I mean, before moving to something else, we have, I don't want to quote Frédéric Geny, but we have to learn to walk before we run. So, I mean, it's not because we have to stick to all tools, because I think that if we are quite certain that tomorrow will be another day, and this is the Gone with the Wind, not Freddie, so a lot of quotations, but if we are quite sure that tomorrow there will be another day, I think that it's not a good idea to remain continuing to assume the status quo. So we have to do something else, especially, I think that this morning when we talked about conglomerate mergers and the role of scope economies, I think that it is quite clear that, for instance, what in the past could be considered a diversification strategy, a typical conglomerate merger, nowadays, because of the role played by data, that play a sort of glue that, aggregate complements and substitutes. Now we have to take into consideration something like that. I don't think that market shares are useful in these cases. I think that we have to look at that in a different way. And it is not a good idea to assume the novelties, something which is difficult, so we have to ignore them and continue thinking in the past. But again, fortunately, dynamic exercises are not so, are becoming more frequent, but we're still working on something that is static enough not to make huge mistakes, okay?
That's clear. Thibaud, you want to say, you want to take a stab at this? As you're starting your life as an enforcer.
No, I think we have the last round table of the day to talk about capabilities. I think that's we'll wait to have the instructions of what we can do there. No, but I think I agree. It's not the exercise is clearly difficult on both sides, so for the enforcers, but also for advisors. And the exercise is even more difficult than you said, because if you come up with a high market share, it's, you will have to find a story of why we should believe your 60% market share is not an issue. But at least it's easy to convince your client that there is a strong risk on that side. So unless you have a really reasonable story and you come up with who are the potential competitors and you can justify why these guys are coming in your market, you know you're in trouble. Where it becomes even more difficult is when you have to tell your client that with their 20% market share, there might still be an issue with their merger because we believe that the guy they want to buy is the future competitor or the guy who is coming to disrupt the market tomorrow, and we don't want to let that guy being taken over by one of the others. And here again, where you said the limit is not known today. So it's, but there it becomes extremely difficult on our side to make a story of why your 20% market share is an issue. But as Andrea said, so we need to find ways to develop the new tools that we can use and where to set the new instrument that we can use to replace pure analysis of market share. So hopefully as I said, we don't only do that. And there we know how to do it in some of the industries. So in the pharma, we've done it for years, and it's easier to understand where to look at. So what kind of information you want to look at to decide whether the 60 or 80% market share is an issue or not. In some of the very recent industries, it's obviously we don't have enough knowledge of where to go. So that's why it becomes difficult.
If I may,
of course.
Sorry, even with old tools or relatively old tools, we don't use market shares. We can survive without a relevant market. For instance, diversion ratio and the concept of closeness, the closest competitor. I mean, we don't need market shares. We are speaking of proximity. So there are other instruments to which we are relatively used to that. I mean, I think that we have to do efforts like that. In the past, I mean, before using diversion ratio, I mean, at least speaking for the Italian Competition Authority, I mean, we began to use them 10 years ago. But before that, I mean, 37%, oh, it's problematic. 36, no, it's okay. It's not a great, I mean, I think that the support, the contribution of economists should be mainly focused on the theory of harm. And the theory of harm can use a wide range of different tools. Unfortunately, for dynamic competition, the tools are not yet on the tables, not all of them.
Yeah. I think,
sorry.
Yeah, Wolfgang, please.
Yeah, many thanks for this very interesting inputs. I would like to go a bit more. What I've missed a bit is dynamic competition as innovation competition, and thinking a bit more about this. I have still the feeling that discussion is much about product markets, and potential market is also a term which fits very well the product markets. And we had for a long time now, since 1995, discussion about innovation markets in the US, but also here in a different ways. And I think when we talk about innovation, market definition is always about identifying the relevant competitors. Nothing more. It's not really about the product. It's about what are the relevant competition competitor as a innovation competitors in that way. And I think the practice also of the European Union is also very far, because in the Autorità merger case, for example, they had two levels of different innovation competition analysis. One was about the level of innovation spaces, where they have the R&D, and we have to identify the R&D project, and you can define this. And then they get one step further even and ask about incentives to invest in R&D at all in the whole industry. This was the second level, this very controversially discussed level of the Dowdy-Bock case. And the question is also, who is an innovation competitor? And I think what already is being done or was not really mentioned here is asking about what are the resources that are necessary that someone can innovate in a certain field. That's about the skills, or the dynamic skills, but also about patents, about resources, specific assets, laboratories you need, staff. And this is already done in the merger cases already. And I would like to have this a bit more discussed also on this conceptual level. So asking about that we not look at the products anymore, what's important, so about the capabilities, the resources that are necessary for innovate and put this into the perspective what we are analyzing. And I think in cases this is already done, and I would like to see this also more in guidelines and in the concept that we're discussing about this concept, because this is important, because we need, this was exactly what you're saying, we need, I think, a new innovation-specific assessment concept with different ways how to identify the competitors, and also with different ways how to assess and also whether a merger has negative effects or not. And this is what I would like to bring in a bit in the discussion here.
Yeah, no, that's maybe before I give the floor, Thibaud, you want to, so we get a couple.
I do have a quick comment. So on this idea of incentive to innovate as opposed to the capacity to innovate, if you look at the case law of the EU courts, what they do well, I think, is that they only talk about the incentives when there is a incentive effect, meaning that when the market is primarily driven by competition, right, and not by innovation. And indeed, it seems that if innovation is not the primary survival strategy, then you may want to discuss just the incentive to innovate, but it's not crucial to the survival of the company, as opposed to markets where the court says there is an impact effect, meaning that you have to innovate because innovation drives competition, in which case the EU courts do not discuss the incentive anymore, but discuss the capacity to innovate. So whether you have access to the infrastructure, whether you have the dynamic capabilities and so on and so forth. So I think there's lots of issues in the way the EU courts address innovation, but this is a good point. And indeed, it would be great to see that maybe in the guidelines of the European Commission and being systematically applied by the national competition agencies.
Okay, well, I'll ask the panelists to respond. I don't know if they can respond on behalf of the European Commission, but at least on the...
It's me.
Yeah. Well, let's give it to.
Quite domestic, you know.
I know you.
No, it's okay. No, I think that, I mean, the market definition notice is really welcome, and as far as I know, looking at the final drafts, they are addressing the points that Thibaud just raised. So I think that there are step forwards. We'll see, and I think that the idea that competition. I mean, generally speaking, I have to say something. I don't feel comfortable when there is a sort of trade-off between innovation and competition. I think that innovation is dynamic competition. So there is no conflict between the two. So having said that, I think that, of course, innovation will be the place where the competitive process takes place. And I think that what we are looking for using our tools in order to define the market, if it is necessary to assess market power, is really to look for competitive constraints. And if competitive constraints do not necessarily require the identification of a product of a service, but the identification of a place where there is a competitive process. And I think in this perspective, as far as I know, the market definition notice is moving this direction. But I mean, There's somebody else who could answer in a more complete way, a more reliable way. Fake news, you know.
Thank you.
I mean, I agree that these cases that you mentioned, Professor Kerber, they're very important. Like Dal Dupont, we have this new theory of harm that it's specific to innovation. I think in this case, it was a bit easier maybe for the commission because there were pharma bio cases where, you know, you had the IP right, you had other ways to see that there were clear pipelines, or you could identify things or indicators more easily that could hint who could be a competitor or potential. Thibaud mentioned that earlier. In other cases, like if you want to transfer this framework, let's say, to more pure tech or disruptive tech context, it would be more difficult, I think, and more speculative. And so we go back to our earlier discussion, I think, and I'm not sure what are the best indicators. Yes, I mean, you would have the size or the financial capability of the firm, but then what else could you know, add if you don't have like strictly legal factors like IP rights or something that is strong and durable, so to say. Thanks.
Nicola, I hear you want to ask a question.
Yeah, I have a question. So I think it seems to me we are discussing here the disconnect between structure and behavior. Okay, and so we have a law and we have applied economics based on the law that essentially enforce an idea whereby deviations from a rivalry optimum are associated to outcomes that are considered as adverse to innovation and adverse to economic growth. And the problem we have is that the empirical reality in which we live today, every person that's gone, you know, on the West Coast in the United States or in other, you know, in China, understands that concentrated market structures and large market share do not correlate with suboptimal behavior. And, you know, every of these persons also understand that incumbency doesn't correlate with survival in the business environments. So how do we, so the question today is, if the law has to move, I understand there's constraints in the law says you need to look at market share. Where should we start to look at to break this sort of association between structure and behavior, which drives so much of the law astray from the empirical reality? I mean, you really just need to walk around in the Silicon Valley to understand that there's much more innovation than what we read in decisions. And so the first question is, you know, what do we look at? Like, you know, market share, capabilities, venture capital funding, you know, where concretely should we look at to get a better handle on behavior and discount the structural inference that we refer. And the second thing is this realistic to do this in a policy world in which all the conversation is driven by the neo-Brandeisian structuralist thing, and every agency in the world that tries to be reasonable has to run a little bit after this, right? Like doing more structure. So it is, you know, even worse trying to do this because, you know, there's so much pushback against, you know, being less structuralist in the policy conversation. Those are the two questions I have.
A question or a comment? We don't know.
No, is this realistic and where to look?
You want me to respond?
Oh, yes.
You know, one way to respond is to redefine what you mean by structure. Because after all, you know, what we said about structure is precisely market share, something like that. But there are other things. There are, you know, transaction costs. There are things that when we talk about innovation markets, you know, what accounts for the scarcity there? That can be, you know, the fact that some team works together. All that's not behavior. That's part of a more granular structure. And then I don't think we necessarily have this problem of this dichotomy anymore. That's the way I would go.
Maybe an avenue for further thinking. Anna, you want to say something?
Sorry. It may link to the previous panel about superstar firms and that we don't only need to look about profit maximization, but also cost minimization, productivity, other factors, as you say. But of course, the problem is, how do you, as I said, trade them off? Like, how do you put them all in a framework that, and you decide that in those cases, this factor against these other factors bring you to this conclusion? I think that's the most difficult part. Maybe it's easier to identify some factors in specific settings, like, you know, in the startups, the VC funding, as you say, and other indicators about the potential of the firm. But how to make sense of that as a bottom line, that I don't have an answer.
Okay, so lots of ideas for researchers around the table here. Okay, well, I think we nearly the end of the panel, so we'll stop here, unless you had a last comment from anyone. I'm sure we'll talk about this again in any event. It's certainly not the end. A big round of applause to the panelists, please.